Good morning, everyone. This panel is about Sustainable Development Goal 16, rule of law, freedom of expression, and access to information as a paramount element for good governance. But I would like to begin by thanking Agnes and Columbia University and Howley and all their team for having us here together again, thinking in how to improve justice for free expression and how to resist challenge and overcome global threats to freedom of expression. Thank you, Agnes, again. Perhaps for some of you, this is a kind of a strange panel in a conference about freedom of expression. Why to highlight the Sustainable Development Goals? As many of you know, the Sustainable Development Goal 16 states, and I quote, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions to all levels. And that has 10 targets, of which 4 are particularly relevant to us today. 16.3 promote the rule of law the national and international, at the national and international levels and ensure equal access to justice for all. 16.6 develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. 16.7 ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. And 16.10 ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. So for the first time in history, member states agreed to establish a concrete number of goals, targets, and indicators to measure the implementation of the principles we have agreed 70 years ago on the human rights treaties. More than that, they are not structured in a fragmented way. Rule of law and freedom of expression are under the same umbrella of strengthening institutionality and therefore are considered as an end in itself, but also as mean to achieve other development goals. So how all of us, as a freedom of expression defenders, are engaging into this process? NGOs, universities, media outlets, experts, journalists, think tanks. How are we monitoring our governments, including the judiciary, regarding the implementation of these goals? And why is it so important to do so? That's part of what we have here at this panel this morning. Indeed, next year, 2019, all the 193 nations who agreed on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals will report on their efforts to achieve a particular cluster of SDGs. Among them, especially the SDG 16. Ministers will present what their countries are doing or what they are not doing during the 2019 high-level political forum. As we all know, the priorities of authoritarian rules who just got the power in their hands are reducing the independence of the judiciary and censoring the press. Rule of law and freedom of expression go hand in hand with democracy. As Salman Rushdie once said, 2 things form the bedrock of any open society: freedom of expression and rule of law. If you don't have those things, you don't have a free country. Although this might sound pretty obvious, and especially for us, and even simple to understand, it is not all easy to make the freedom of expression word working and participating with the rule of law word and community. That's, distinguished colleagues, it's a central and core element of this panel. We have invited these 6 amazing guests to share their ideas with us. Lucy Turner is the General Coordinator of the Global Alliance for SDG 16, a recently created platform co-facilitated by UNESCO, UNDP, UNHCR, and UNODC. Lucy, thank you so much for being here. Alejandro Álvarez is the head of Rule of Law Unit within the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. Alejandro, muchas gracias por acompañarnos esta mañana. Michael Camilleri, a dear friend and expert on Inter-American standards on freedom of expression, who used to work for the State Department and for the White House, is now the Rule of Law Director at the Inter-American Dialogue. Thanks, Michael, for being here. Bill Orme, an outstanding veteran journalist and former UN official. He, as the UN representative of the Global Forum for Media Development, was one of the more active advocates for the SDG 1610, the one related to freedom of expression and access to information. Thank you, Bill, for being here. Guilherme Canela is a UNESCO regional advisor in Latin America in charge of connecting the dots of freedom of expression and rule of law. Guilherme coordinates UNESCO agreement with all the 23 Supreme Courts of Iberoamerica. And as you will see, he has done an unbelievable work on freedom of expression with the whole Latin American judiciary. And he has achieved something amazing, an agreement on freedom of expression with all the Supreme Courts of the region. Thanks, Guilherme, for being here and for all the work that you have done on freedom of expression in the region. Irene Khan, who is a very distinguished human rights advocate, currently holds the position of Director General of International Development Law Organization, and she is also a former Secretary General for Amnesty International. Irene, thank you for being here. Dear colleagues, I would like to start with the same question for all of you. A question that tends to show the difficulties, but at the same time, the importance of SDG 16 for freedom of expression and rule of law. We know that it was not easy to get the SDG 16 among the 17 SDGs endorsed by UN member states. We know that it was particularly difficult to include the target related to fundamental freedoms and access to information. Why is it still so difficult to land what we have accepted as international treaties in concrete policies with goals, targets, indicators? Lucy, let's start with, please. Everyone will have no more than 5 minutes to share your thoughts on this first question.
Thanks, Catalina. I think the first thing is clearly political. There's a lot of fear around SDG 16 because it's about empowering people. It's about ensuring equality. It's about promoting inclusivity. And clearly, if the benefits of governance are dominated by a certain part of society, they would quite understandably sometimes fear loss of those benefits. If you work, to take a notoriously corrupt industry, construction, if due to lack of transparency, lack of access to information, lack of freedom of expression around the implications of those types of activities or extractive industry, you lose the benefits that can be accrued from those activities, then clearly you would not support an agenda that is about addressing access to information, freedom of expression, and promoting benefits for all people. The other part is about lack of knowledge. We don't yet know really what works to promote SDG 16. Partly that's because it's a new agenda. It's not as well established as, for example, the health and education sectors of international development. It barely made it into the 2030 agenda, and now it's there. We're all asking ourselves really what works. Now, for much of the last 10 years, I've been working in the field and to promote what we call rule of law, access to justice, these core aspects of SDG 16. So me and colleagues, we have our own experience. We have a sense of what works. But because this is so difficult to measure, because it's so new and because to be able to know what works, you really need different parts of government to come together, including with civil society and with business, because each has different types of information that would help us to establish what really works. We're not yet there. We don't have a really clear sense of what works that would enable evidence-based action. And especially in the countries where this work is most needed, it's most challenging to be able to get that information and to be able to support the development and implementation of effective policy. I mean, if we take the justice system as an example, we know that to be able to reduce impunity, you need the police, the prosecution, the courts, the prison service, at a minimum, to work together effectively. And often, in conflict-affected countries, you know, there are political allegiances and all kinds of conflict-related dynamics which make this very difficult. I mean, if you have, for example, the Attorney General's office allied with a certain part of government, you have the police, which has a certain other set of allegiances. Civil society often crystallizes the conflict dynamic. Rebellions can often crystallize in civil society. It's very hard for them to sit together and work together and develop the kind of joined-up action which is really needed. So I would say those are the three main things we face at this time. One is political pushback. One is lack of knowledge on what we can really do, A, to address that political pushback and to develop and implement effective policies. And one is the lack of the information on what the challenges are, what the opportunities are, because all the people with that information don't systematically or even often work together.
Thank you, Lucy. Wonderful. Irene, would you like to continue?
Okay. Of course, I agree. Lucy gave.
You have to.
Lucy gave a very concise and clear analysis of why is it difficult. And I like the present tense because it is still difficult. Just the fact that a piece of paper is signed in the UN, especially a non-binding document, means very little in practice. So there is a lot of work ahead. My organization, IDLO, along with others, such as UNDP, worked very hard during the process to counter resistance. Now, there was for developing countries, the group of 77, a very clear, there was a fear that this is human rights conditionality through the back door. Yeah. And developing countries don't want to mix aid with other issues. Right now in the UN, there's a discussion about sustaining peace and developing countries are saying we don't want aid and security coming together. So there was that. Then there was, of course, fears of national sovereignty, national security, which Lucy has mentioned, and also what is it, what this is all about. You have development first, and then human rights. That was the approach taken by many governments at that time. However, I would also say that there is a deeper problem that we need to acknowledge in civil society. Now, in coming on this panel, I'm kind of conflicted because I come from a human rights background, but now I'm part of the intergovernmental structure. But let us be honest about civil society. Civil society is divided. The human rights movement is not engaged in development debates. The dichotomy between economic and social rights and civil and political rights is very much alive. And not so long ago, Philip Alston talked about ships are passing by in the night. And so you didn't have a concerted civil society movement to make these issues clear, why the right to information is fundamental to development, why an independent judiciary protects not only your right to a fair trial, but the issue of balance of interests, for example, in environmental protection issues, or equal access to social services, and so on. That debate, if you look at SDG 16 indicators, the target, the goal talks about inclusion, but look at the targets. It's very much heavily on the side of criminal justice, not on the side of fighting discrimination, where you would actually need an effective judiciary, an independent judiciary, for instance. So there is still a lot of confusion as to where SDG 16 is going. And that's going to be a real challenge when it comes to reporting and getting governments to report. Just reporting on homicide figures, for example, or pre-detention figures say very little about whether the justice system is effectively responding to the needs of poor people or women, for example, vulnerable groups. So there's a huge, big challenge still out there.
Thank you, Irene. Alejandro, what do you think about it?
Thank you. Thank you, Catalina, for the invitation, and all of you for taking the time to come to this debate that is certainly very timely and important. What I would like to say first of all is that well, the world out there is not an easy one right now, and actually it's much worse than it was 5 years ago or maybe 10 years ago, and there is a real global crisis of global governance right now. And I'm saying this because actually it's important to also value what we have, because it's not sure that we are still going to have our liberties forever. So actually, it's time still to keep the fight for liberties. I would like to say that at this very moment, the world is so polarized, so blocked, that what we are seeing is that the overall human rights agenda globally and in the UN is pretty much under stress and under attack. We can see this, by the discussions that we have in particular countries at the Security Council, how member states are discussing, budgets, where the cuts are and where they are not cutting. And I can tell you, the first thing that they are looking at is all those institutions, all those issues that protect rights, including the liberty of expression. So look at what's happening in Syria, for example, and how much the Security Council is blocked, divided, and we cannot just take decisions about that. The consequence of that is, first, people dying. Second, total impunity for violations of international law. And the consequences of this is a message to the globe that actually, no matter what you do, you're going to be just, able to run. So we are facing now a situation where international institutions are unable to govern the planet as we were used to. The Secretary General, in his address on Syria, he said something that, obviously, I didn't think that, I would hear this in my lifetime, but he said something like, the Cold War is back. How sad is that? So, if I'm saying this, it's because actually what we are also looking is that there is, if you wish, two trends that we are following closely regarding, the topic that we are discussing right now, liberty of expression and SDG 16, which is one, the use of counterterrorism legislation and work to shut down or to attack liberty of expression, also liberty of religion. And we can see this in many, many places. Counterterrorism laws and practices are becoming more and more infringent on private life. Liberty of expression, the use of internet to express, opinions. That is one tendency that we are seeing, and that is certainly very worrisome. The second one, if you wish, is the attempt of many governments to just shut down entire networks, apps, the attacks on the press, fake news, and all of that, just to impose a single view of the world. So what I would say then is that, and this is not only in some, you can see this in North America, you can see this in Europe, you can see this, in all regions of the world. I mean, I'm not singling out any particular country, and I think that, you all going to agree with me, because this is kind of a friendly audience, right? For this kind of... So, I mean, I don't know those that are watching, over the internet, but so this is why I would say it's so important in this very difficult moment, to cling on those agreed agendas that actually expand what we have or help us to keep at least, the extent of liberties that we have now, at least, as declarations or, in instruments, because obviously there are many, many places where those liberties and those instruments still, do not mean much. And Goal 16 and the SDG agenda is maybe our, generational opportunity to see changes, to fight for changes, to manifest and to press for changes. I don't want to underestimate. I really want to put this in a historical context, and I think that you, Catalina, you did a good job on that, because it's historical. And Goal 16, we are still celebrating that actually it made it, in the SDG agenda. We didn't even believe that that could have been possible. So the question is now that we cannot leave this opportunity go. And we had to put all our efforts to make it happen. And people from civil society, different parts of governments, and Lucy said, need to be there, to make sure that their governments not only implement, but also are able to report on what they are doing, in the public arena, in UN fora, but also, making this transparent as much as we can, because this is what will create, accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. Bill, champion.
Thank you. And I just endorse everything that my fellow panelists have just said. Just to take a couple of steps back, I represented and continue to represent at the UN the Global Forum for Media Development, which is a fairly loose network with a very small secretariat in Brussels of almost 200 NGOs that work in media training, press law reform, press freedom issues around the world, most of them in countries in the South. And when some of us first went before the negotiations really started to propose that we get actively engaged in this, I don't think it would surprise any of you that these are mostly journalists, and they thought, why would we want to waste our time spending 2 years in UN negotiations, which, like Irene says, is going to produce something that's non-binding and the governments are going to ignore, and like they do already. Clearly, some of us disagreed, and it is my personal belief still, and my starting point is that the inclusion of SDG 16 is potentially quite profound. And the area that we at GFMD have worked on specifically, there are 10 targets. We've worked on the 10th target, which is access to information and the protection of fundamental freedoms, could be seen as nothing more than another reiteration or attempt to implement the original pledge of the famous words of Article 19 of the Universal Declaration, that everyone has the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any medium and regardless of frontiers. And there's some truth to that. And like Irene said, this was, in effect, it was a backdoor reference to human rights. The phrase human rights appears in none of the targets. That's why there was a long battle, and fundamental freedoms becomes the synonym, if you will, for that, precisely because of that fear this was going to be conditionality in disguise. But, I can say, as someone who comes to this as both a former journalist and someone who worked in the UN system, I think with all the appropriate cynicism as well, is that already you're seeing a lot of countries around the world who are taking this quite seriously. and trying to prove to their own constituents, to their own citizens, to their neighbors, that they are actually trying in good faith to put these things into practice. And I think Latin America is an especially interesting example, because as a region, it has been in the vanguard of serious access to information legislation and the implementation of it. I mean, I don't know, your degree of familiarity with how this is going to be measured, but one of the obstacles we still face, and again, as Irene said, this we're talking not in the past tense, this is happening right now. SDG 16 is the single biggest differentiation between the SDGs and the MDGs which preceded them. This was the new agenda. The SDGs include gender equity and a number of the different goals and targets, environmental protection, and other things that the MDGs did not. But the significant inclusion of what is ultimately human rights and democratic governance, the rule of law and these fundamental freedoms, was the biggest single battle in the negotiation process. And the resistance to it, I would think it's fair to say still, was on two levels, and it's important to understand how the UN system works in these things. There were governments which you could name off the top of your heads and you expect to never liked this to begin with. Some of them said this openly and some of them did not say it. But there was also sort of a middle ground of governments who were uneasy about what they saw as the realm of the unmeasurable. Whereas the premise of the MDGs, that these were things that were countable, infant mortality rates and, things that have to do with public health and education and so forth. Whereas the whole realm of governance and human rights and freedom of expression is not something that national statistical institutions, agencies, anywhere, including in Europe or the United States, are typically asked to count or measure. And so it was a completely reasonable pushback in a way to say, well, okay, we put this agenda out there, but how are we going to track it? How are we going to measure it? My group, GFMD, in response to that, formed a coalition with a group of other NGOs in the SDG 16 realm, each of us being specialists in one of the 10 targets. And we created something called the SDG 16 Data Initiative, which was primarily to demonstrate that not only is this measurable, it is in fact being measured. It's just not being measured for the most part by governments. It's being measured by academics, it's being measured by civil society organizations, and that it is our collective assertion that yes, there's gaps in the data and so forth, but there's a lot of credible information out there. And even such a seemingly simple thing as SDG 1610, the UNESCO, Guilherme will tell you more, has been given the task, that's the way these things work, each of these 169 targets has to have a designated UN system agency that is responsible for tracking progress towards that target. It's a seemingly simple thing. It is the number of countries that have passed and implemented access to information legislation. And then the other half of it, because this is a binary target, these are connected on fundamental freedoms, the measurement there is actually about the attacks, including the killings of journalists, human rights defenders, and labor activists. And that's a separate issue. We could talk about that separately. But on the first part of it, even a simple thing of counting the number of countries that have access to information legislation, so that's just something that the UN system had done in any formal way, but it's not a difficult thing to do. But the second part of it is defining implementation. That's where it gets interesting. And many of us fought very hard to have that word implement included, so it was not just passage. And what we are seeing now around the world is that and again, I go back to Latin America because I think that's where civil society and the media has been most active, both in the passage of this legislation, because it's been fairly recent, and also in the use of the legislation. There is a consensus in those countries that you cannot just expect governments, to report themselves on how well they're doing in providing access to information. You need to have consultation with the users, with the citizens, with civil society, with the media. And that is in fact beginning to happen in countries which are, in governments, which believe that they should be proud of the fact that they have passed this legislation, and they wish to demonstrate to their own people that they are taking this seriously, and they become models elsewhere. You can already see, I think, the impact in Africa of what has been happening happening in Latin America, which is a lot more pertinent than Europe or the United States. I mean, I would be the first to say as an American journalist that the U.S. Freedom of Information Act is highly, highly imperfect on multiple levels. And most of the laws passed in Latin America in the past 10 years, not all of them, are far superior to the legislation in the United States or in Canada. Now, I wouldn't want to exaggerate the fact that the SDGs are a driver of this, but I think that they are beginning to be that. And if media and civil society in these countries insist, because there's going to be a formal reporting for the first time in 2019 on progress to this, which will be the baseline, but this will continue to happen through 2030. So this actually gives kind of a toehold for activists in media, in civil society, and even opposition parties and others in countries to ensure that there is continued progress. And I'll stop here. To me, the best thing about this particular goal in general is that this is not in the normal sort of north-south paradigm or the old established democracies versus the younger emerging democracies, authoritarian countries. Actually, the best actors in this field are an interestingly mixed lot. And some of the countries you would expect to be more in the vanguard in Europe and, as I said, in North America, actually have a lot of ground to make up in their implementation of this. So this is a place where all of us can learn from each other. And that was the premise of the SDGs, that unlike the MDGs, which, going back to the aid issue, which is supposed to be kind of a grand bargain between the donor countries and the donor recipient countries, the SDGs are supposed to apply to all countries equally, that there are things that all of us can and should be doing in our respective societies, and gender, environmental preservation, the rule of law, and in this case, press freedom and access to information. So I don't want to be seen as Panglossian or pie-eyed but I think that it's already very encouraging that this got passed, and it's already very encouraging to see to the degree that civil society groups and media organizations around the world are taking this seriously and holding governments to account.
Thank you, Bill. Guilherme.
Well, thank you. Nothing much to add to this assessment, why it's so difficult to implement. But I think the political component is kind of clear, no? So if you are an ambassador of a country or a minister, even if it's not an authoritarian regime, would you prefer to be in a room discussing how to build new schools, improving the health system, or you would prefer to be in a room where the keywords are reducing homicides, reducing corruption, reducing the killing of journalists? So SDG 16 is all the hot potatoes of this discussion, no? So I would bring attention to this important fact that is, and I will borrow this idea of Isaiah Berling on negative freedoms and positive freedoms. When I discuss with ministers the importance of freedom of expression or freedom of information, they tell me, but we already have the law. We already have this in the Constitution. We are not doing anything to prevent that. And that's our role. And it's very hard to make them understand that also for those freedoms, we need policies, which means we need money, we need budget. The safety journalism mechanism in Colombia, as Toby said yesterday, costs $7 million a year. So we need an indicator to tell that. The freedom of information law in this country, the implementation only for the federal level, costs $700 million a year. So I think that going to the ground, and I'm not talking about those that are against for political reasons, because they really don't want to protect journalists, they really don't want to have access to information. It's hard for governments to understand that fundamental freedoms also demand policies as building schools, hospitals. And I think this is a very important challenge for SDG 16, to show that we need policies. We need to have all those things any policy need for this. This is one. The other thing is it's harder to control the outcomes. When you build a school, when you put the students there, you say, okay, I have all those different students and I raise the indicator. But even if you do everything to protect journalists, you don't have the control to the drug dealer that goes there and kill the guy. So it's harder, and you are putting yourself in a very complicated position in accepting those kind of indicators. So we also need to understand from the government's perspective the difficulty of this, so it will make easier to help them to go to 2019 and say, well, how can we work together towards improve this agenda, acknowledging that it's difficult. And finally, to pick up a point that Bill made, I think it's very important. This thing of this applies to all countries, is at the same time part of why it's so difficult. The Prime Minister of a very consolidated democracy said in his autobiography he made 3 mistakes during his tenure, and one of them it was approving a freedom of information law. And I'm not talking about a complicated authoritarian country. I'm talking about a 300 years democracy. So it's hard, even for those countries. So this is part of the difficulties, but it's also a huge opportunity when we can convince countries that it's not this agenda is not only for the so-called developing world. It's for all of us. So I think this is, as Bill said, one of our avenues to try to make this thing move forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Guilherme. Michael.
Thanks, Catalina. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. You failed to mention my best qualification for this discussion, was just having worked for you. I hope to not do anything to raise questions about your decision to hire me and what I say. So I'll be brief, and I'll try to, I think, complement and largely echo what others have said, but just to talk a little bit about the context geopolitically in which these conversations are taking place. So 2017 was the 12th straight year of decline in global freedom. We are, I think, very clearly moving toward a multipolar world in which global governance is shared between democratic states and non-democratic states, a landscape marked particularly by the increasing influence of China. The post-World War II liberal global order was already under strain and under stress, but it's been, I think, further undermined by an administration in the United States which is, to put it mildly, deeply ambivalent, it would seem, about at least some aspects of that global order. Authoritarian governments that in the past were satisfied with questioning, essentially with playing defense, with questioning the universality or the legitimacy of the international human rights regime, for example, are now challenging this regime more openly, putting their governance models forward as alternatives with increasing confidence and somewhat to my surprise with some resonance in places where you perhaps wouldn't expect it. Emerging powers, even those with strong traditions of democracy and human rights and rights-respecting legal frameworks, have not always advocated forcefully for these values at the international level. I think this is very clear, I think, in Latin America, where I do a lot of work, but I think the same could probably be said for countries like India and South Africa. So if we were ever complacent enough to think that these philosophical and legal battles were won in a definitive way, I think the past few years will have disabused us of that notion. In Geneva, I'm told there is now talk of a post-human rights world. Certainly we are a long way from the end of history. These are battles that we will be fighting and refighting in the years to come on a playing field that is not likely to get any easier, frankly. Having thoroughly depressed you all, I will say, I think having secured the inclusion of Goal 16 in the SDGs in this context is pretty remarkable. I think it's quite an achievement. I think it owes a lot probably to individuals in this room, to officials at the UN and in key governments, and I would include there my colleagues in the Obama administration. So I think the good news is having kind of emerged from this very difficult geopolitical context and from a multilateral process that's reflective of the current state of global governance, the SDGs, I think, have a particular legitimacy that renders them a potentially powerful platform for advancing the cause of fundamental freedoms, of access to information, transparency, and more generally, strong, inclusive legal institutions, including with governments and non-state actors that are perhaps less open than the people in this room would be to traditional human rights arguments. And I think just to maybe end with something that Irene mentioned, it maybe reflects the start of the conversation we need to be having between development and human rights. And I think harnesses not just the arguments on universality that all of us can rehearse very well, but the empirical evidence, which I think is increasingly strong, of the linkages between development and human rights, and more specifically between institutions and rule of law on the one hand, and development, poverty reduction, and peace, both positive and negative, on the other hand. So I think there's a lot of potential and power there, and I would just tip my hat to the work that Guilherme is doing, particularly to really sort of operationalize the SDGs with judges, high court judges in Latin America, as an example of how these goals, this goal in particular, SDG 16, can be harnessed for good. Thanks.
Thank you. Wonderful, Michael. Lucy, let me get back to you. How can we stimulate a productive discussion on freedom of expression during the next year high-level political forum, when we expected the member states to present development regarding these issues?
You know, I'm just realizing now, listening to my colleagues here, how important it is that we seize that opportunity, because although we are in a bit of a dark moment, progress is being made, and it's so important that we showcase that at an international level. Now, I was just thinking now, I was reminded of my father. Now, my father was a sailor, my grandfather was a sailor, my uncle was a sailor. I'm from a long line of sailors, and I didn't have stories read to me as a child. I had one of these illuminated globes, and my father would tell me about the journeys he had made in different parts of the ocean. And often there would be storms, you can imagine, and some of these voyages sounds like were really very hairy. And this has also been part of my life, to go on ships, because my home is on an island. It takes 11 hours to get to, even from Edinburgh. Now, sometimes the sea is really choppy. And, you wonder sometimes, is this boat going to go over? My father always used to say, keep your eye on the horizon, and that means you won't feel sick, because it's the only thing that doesn't move. And I think it's so important now to remember that the progress is never linear. And when you're in countries that have experienced war, when most progress is being made, things seem to be worse than ever. I mean, physically, the streets, when streets are being made, when cities being shaped up. I mean, I remember in Sierra Leone, it looked terrible. It looked like the war had finished 5 minutes ago, even though it actually finished 10 years ago, because people were taking action, because progress was being made. And we know the same is true even when we're doing intensive cleaning or decorating. I mean, at a certain point, the place looks damned awful because it's on its way to being better. And there's even an evidence base around this when we can see in, Pinker recently published a sort of a defense, I guess, of the argument he made in The Better Angels of Our Nature, when he argued famously that actually the path of peace and progress is assured, we are on our way to a better world. He also argued that progress is not linear, there have been dips. And maybe we're in one of these dips. And it's so important that in 2019, we gather together those stories of progress, and that we also help to unite those people who strongly believe in creating a better world to such an extent that they are investing in it, often with very low pay, often with very difficult conditions, often in fear of their lives. And Irene pointed this out, that there's a challenge, of course, also that even those effectively what would be the advocates for positive change don't stand together. And I think this is part of the work that we do in the Global Alliance, is to support all those drives of change, wherever they exist in government, in civil society, in the private sector, to stand together and to work together to achieve greater progress. So that's a preamble, really. I'll just end my preamble with a word. It's a Sanskrit word, so from the Indian subcontinent, and a Greek word too called agathism. So these ancient concepts are written into languages in many cultures, and it's about this core concept that life is getting better. And the Dalai Lama even said recently, without doubt, love is increasing on the earth. So I want us to hang on to this hope and to keep working, because hope comes from participation in hopeful actions. And if we despair, that will be the antidote to hope, and it will prevent us taking action to create a better world. Okay, so the HLPF 2019.
I vote for Lucy. I vote for Lucy.
We all do.
So, right, so it's very important that we get people's attention at HLPF 2019, because SDG 16 is not the only one under review. There are another 5 under review, including ones with very substantial lobbies, like on education, climate action. So altogether, there will be more than 80 indicators that governments will be invited to report on. So we have 2, right, on 16.10. So I would say if we want to get people to care about SDG 16, SDG 16.10 on freedom of expression, access to information, we can really care about Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 19 and protection of journalists and human rights defenders and developing and implementing legislation on access to information. I would humbly suggest that we also reframe so that we can speak to people who perhaps aren't as passionate about this. We need information, access to information and freedom of expression for implementation of the whole of the 2030 agenda. We know that people must first know about their rights before they claim them. They need to know they have a right to vaccination campaigns, to education, to not be raped. They need to know what their rights are. So access to information about your rights is necessary for you to claim them, and so to achieve all of the goals. Secondly, and I described it in the beginning, you're not going to end up with an effective government systems to deliver those goods and services which vindicate all of the rights of all the 2030 agenda, unless the various institutions of government and others can work together. I mean, we know that's why we have so many people in prisons around the world who have been there years after they've served their sentences, or were never charged with anything because their dockets were lost and no one's really tracking. Or cases fall between the cracks of the justice system because the police and prosecution aren't really clear about their respective responsibilities for investigating to ensure that the case is good enough to go through the courts. So we need information systems to connect government institutions so that they can respond. I mean, you literally need to make sure that a budgetary allocation for school books or vaccination campaigns is transferred down to local level. You need to be able to track that. The other thing is that you need freedom of expression to know what to provide. I mean, you need to know where the schools need to be built, where the road would be most relevant to go from which community to which market. So to know what to do, how to perform as a government to serve your citizens, to meet their needs in any area of the SDGs, you need them to tell you what their needs are, what the challenges they face are in obtaining their rights, and then you can help to form policy that responds to their needs. So what I'm saying here is that access to information, freedom of expression, yes, they're about the core elements in Article 19. It's about protecting journalists and human rights defenders, but it's also about laying the foundation for effective governance and delivering on everything that's in the 2030 agenda. And also, crucially, to be able to get the information on any aspect of the agenda that you need to be able to promote progress. And I think if we reframe it in this way, that we can help more people to care about this agenda. But it wouldn't be a new thing. I mean, why in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does Article 19 on freedom of information, freedom of expression, access to information precede the rights to education, health, and other services? Because it literally comes first. It's literally prior. So I would suggest that reframe. The other thing I want to say, whilst I'm very excited, our constituency is very excited about HLPF and working towards it feverishly, I would say, is that we need to have a reality check about what it is. So SDG 16 will be under review in 2019, and then there'll be another opportunity in 2023. It will be a few days, a little over a week, where governments gather to discuss these issues. For them to have something to say, and for all of us to seize this opportunity, we need to invest at country level. So I absolutely echo what Guilherme said about let's support governments to make progress on this instead of just sometimes I feel like a lot of the work we do is as you know, human rights defenders, rule of law professionals, whatever you want to call us, is we let governments know what their responsibilities are and point out where they're failing. But sometimes it's like starving a child and then criticizing it when it doesn't run well. I mean, they need help to be able to implement and to serve their citizens, to meet the expanding circle of human rights for growing populations. The good thing is that the HLPF, the High Level Political Forum, which is the final level of reporting at global level, is actually the final stage in a series of reports, and the voluntary national review is the reporting that takes place at national level. And the guidelines on this, the guidance on this, is that governments lead consultations with civil society, with human rights defenders, with journalists, with all parts of academia, civil society, and national private sector to ascertain what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, what do we need, what do we want, what kind of country do we want to live in, and what would it take to get there. So that's an opportunity for everyone to become as powerful as journalists are. Why are journalists attacked? They're powerful because they're storytellers. Now, I'm more or less a bit of a data geek. I believe in evidence-based policy. I believe in evidence-based action. I believe in statistics. But I also believe in stories, because stories move people and emotion moves people to action. So what you can do, if you do a good voluntary national review process, if governments really do bring the country together to get a sense of where are we as a country, what stories do we have to tell about our lives and as a country, you will end up with a real sense of how life is changing that data and statistics alone cannot present. So I really want to advocate for us all investing in the voluntary national review process at country level now, so that governments have things to say in 2019. And I'll just end with a final reflection on, I think, why that's important, building on what Alejandro said, and Irene also. This is a time of division. This is a time of polarization. I would say it's also a reflection of it's like the last kind of resistance to assured progress, is my view. But what we need is to unite people. And that's what we're doing in the Global Alliance, of bringing together different actors from throughout society. We need to build empathy and understanding between different constituencies, between different communities, between different sectors, between different silos. And we do that when we enable people to tell the stories about who they are, how their lives are lived, the challenges they face, the opportunities available to them. And then you will engage them in also trying to create that, that better world and to achieve the targets and indicators set out in the 2030 Agenda.
Thank you, Lucy. Wonderful. Alejandro, we know that the UN Secretary General is paying lots of attention in fostering rule of law worldwide. How are you connecting this mandate with the other elements we have been debating here? particularly enhancing and protecting freedom of expression?
It's a difficult question.
I know. It's my job.
Well, I think I should have prepared that question because I knew about that. But what I can say is that, well, you know, I mentioned this before. So I'm sorry if I refer to, you know, to global kind of things, and you know, I'm doing this, you know, if you wish, on purpose. So just to share with you trends. You know, many people here in this panel refer to the polarization, refer to the blockage that we have in global relations, and the damage that this is doing. You know, Lucy is bringing some, you know, much more positive, hopeful view, as you know she usually does. Thank you, Lucy, for that. But what I would say is that you know. The real point that the Secretary General is trying to make is that whatever we have discussions and we make decisions as a global community, there's only one bedrock that we are counting on, which is our shared values, human rights. And it doesn't matter if this is a peace and security matter. If it's not important if this is a development issue. You know, at the very end, what we still need to nurture and protect is those values, those that help us to get to this point in time in history. And this is again human rights. So. I would say that the Secretary General is, as he said several times, it's not that I am trying to interpret what he said. You know, he mentioned this several times in several different parts, that he is worried about the sovereignty, national sovereignty agenda, you know, taking over our common values. And countries going, you know, back to themselves, and then, you know, having little to share, you know, being less interested in compromising, and also, I would say, you know, since now we don't have the tools, if you wish, to solve the conflicts that were designed for a world that was dominated by the United States. Let's put it that way. This is not the case anymore. I think that, you know, our colleague there, you know, mentioned that as well. So we are going towards a different type of governance. And the question is if the tools that we have will actually help us or will be a liability. So what the Secretary General is saying is, well, you know, wherever we are going, just let's make sure that we are not infringing on what took us here, which is our common, you know, our common values as, you know, humankind, you know, human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, you're just arriving from the Americas Summit in Lima, Peru. The final declaration condemned the corruption in the region and called for more transparency and accountability. At the same time, journalists are still murdered in this very same region. In some countries of the Americas, the judiciary are sending journalists to jail, and in others, judicial powers have their autonomy undermined. Have you noticed a real commitment to change this scenario, particularly on freedom of expression?
Thanks. Yeah, so since I was so grim in my opening remarks, let me try to be a little more positive. The Summit of the Americas, I think, was quite successful. Ivanka's shoes were fabulous, but maybe more importantly, there was a consensus declaration with 57 concrete commitments on anti-corruption. This was everything from prosecutorial cooperation to open government and procurement, to transparency of beneficial ownership and political finance, to protection of journalists and whistleblowers. This is significant not just because of the substance of the commitments, but because the Summit of the Americas had become this sort of paralyzed process that hadn't produced a declaration, a consensus declaration on anything for a few summits, much less something as consequential as anti-corruption, something so central to citizen demands in the Americas. And I don't think this would have happened without precisely the strong demand signal from citizens and the feeling, I think, among many governments they needed to walk away with something to show. So I think I do think that's significant. Now, I understand the cynic's view, which is this is just an aspirational document. It's not a self-executing plan of action. And as you mentioned, Catalina, the sort of lofty goals in this declaration contrast with the reality that we see on the ground in many of the countries that signed up to the declaration. So generally speaking, in the Americas, freedom of expression is legally protected, but journalists and human rights defenders are still murdered, mostly with impunity. Mexico last year was the second most dangerous country in the world for journalists after Syria. Judiciaries are formally independent, but selection processes for judges and prosecutors are often corrupted or captured. And corruption itself, while illegal, is not just widespread, but in some cases systemic, as we've seen in Brazil. So clearly we are far from the effective, accountable, inclusive institutions envisioned in SDG 16. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, which we can go into, but basically, the first reason is it turns out this is pretty hard. Constructing effective judicial systems is probably the most kind of stubborn democratic institution building task, at least in the Latin American countries that democratized in the 1980s and 90s. But there's another piece of this, which is that the political will to do this, to build strong institutions, has not always been there, and we see this in the low tax takes in places like Central America. We see it in efforts to politicize judiciaries and roll back investigative tools like plea bargaining. We see it nowadays in the pushback from political and economic elites to the significant progress that some judicial systems in the region have made against corruption and investigating corruption. And I'd mentioned places like Brazil and Guatemala and Peru, and I think it's important to acknowledge in the case of Guatemala with a strong assist from the UN in the form of CICIG. So I agree that, and I'll conclude here, I agree that some realism and skepticism is warranted, but I still see the glass as half full. I think in many countries in the Americas, citizens are mobilized around accountability in ways that we haven't seen. And I think judicial institutions, partly in response to those citizen demands, are displaying an impressive degree of independence and technical capacity. So I'm tempted to believe that we are at a potential rule of law tipping point, but I'm quick to acknowledge it's a fragile one, and I think the challenge is to make sure it's not fleeting.
Thank you, Mike. Bill, the Global Forum for Media Development congregates more than 200 media development organizations who lobbied with success for the SDG 1610. Do you feel they understand the importance to also connect with other elements of the agenda, such as the strengthening of the rule of law?
That's an excellent question. I mean, some do. Some are beginning to see it this way, but one of the arguments we made from the beginning, which was frankly as much a tactical as a more lofty strategic argument, was that when we first proposed lobbying for the inclusion of an access to information / freedom of expression commitment in the SDGs, I and others said, we fully expect to lose this battle, but we think it is a fight worth fighting to make sure there is at least an open discussion about this. And with any such negotiation process, it became clear that if you use the term human rights or freedom of expression, you were not going to succeed. Access to information, however, became kind of a more comfortable place for a lot of governments. And our argument, which is not a cynical, it was a genuine argument, both tactical and strategic, was to try to, if you will, repurpose the way this is commonly seen, which is commonly seen first in the human rights dimension, but also equally troubling for many governments in the kind of narrow anti-corruption purpose of access to information legislation, to look at public contracts and so forth, which of course is a good thing. But our argument was that this was an enabling mechanism for the entire package of the SDGs. That is to say that we cannot know if we're succeeding in any of these 17 goals and 169 targets unless we have access to information about each and every one of them. That seems like stating the blindingly obvious. But if you brought it back to the origin story of the SDGs, which was the MDGs, even people who were engaged in the proselytization for the MDGs professionally, like myself in the UN system, might have had a hard time off the top of their head naming all 8 of them. Those are only half as many as the 17 SDGs. But what we in the public did know, in places that were paying attention, that the first of the MDGs, which was to reduce poverty, the indicator was to reduce it by 50% of what was considered extreme poverty, which were people who were said by World Bank statistics to be earning less than $1.25 a day. And that succeeded. Now the SDGs, and this is really important to keep in mind, the first target, the first goal is to eradicate extreme poverty. That is to say, to finish the unfinished business of the SDGs. Now, without getting into the weeds of all the other 17 goals, the fact is that any of these things, gender equity, rule of law, environmental protection, eradicating eradicable diseases, all of these are required if your goal is, only to eradicate extreme poverty. That's to say that aside from being venerable, worthwhile goals unto themselves, they are also mechanisms by which you achieve the first goal. And so I think that if you are if you're a journalist and you're in any country, you have to talk about these in ways which make sense in local national realities. And I think one thing that I've found in looking at access to information legislation, as many of you undoubtedly know, 25 years ago, there were only a dozen or so countries in the world that had access to information bills. Now you have 112, 113, that is to say a solid majority of the 193 member states. But it's new by definition. It's in the last 10 to 15 years. And to look at how these are actually being used, in most places, I think it's fair to say, it was pushed from that anti-corruption, transparency, disclose what governments are doing and what they're spending, that part of the agenda, which is fine. But if you look at how ordinary citizens use these laws, the ministries that get the highest number of requests fairly consistently that I've looked at in Latin America are the education and health ministries, not the finance ministries or the budget ministries, because people want to know about schooling, they want to know about health clinics, they want to know about things that affect their personal lives. And I think that is the way that journalists and civil society people have to think about the SDGs to make them not some lofty UN abstraction, but things that are actually going to make people's lives better, and that it is another mechanism to hold governments to account. Because after all, even though it's voluntary, they all signed off on these things.
Thank you, Bill. Guilherme, SDG 16 is about strengthening institutions, and especially strengthening the judiciary. You have been involved in an initiative in Latin America who has trained more than 8,000 operators on freedom of expression, access to information, and safety of journalists issues. How is it working? Does It is working.
You know, the other day I was in Paris with these people in UNESCO dealing with this horrible thing called results-based management. So they are like annoying me with these stupid questions about outputs and outcomes and whatever. And they said, well, training 80,000 judges and prosecutors is an output, it's not an outcome. And I tell them, look, you know how hard it is to involve in a conversation someone that didn't want it to be involved. It was not paying attention in this issue. So of course, if we are saying that we are including 80,000 children in a school, they are supposed to be included. It's part of that. If we are buying computers, it's outputs. But if you are involving judges in a conversation about freedom of expression, you can't only consider that as a number, as outputs. You should consider that as an outcome in itself. And even more if these are chief justices that you are involved in this conversation. So I think, and it's not my merit, it's the merit of lots of people that are involved in this initiative that started 5 years ago. This is a result in itself. Getting these 80,000 judges and prosecutors discussing freedom of expression, safety of journalists and access to information, it's really interesting. And not for us, it's really interesting for the region, for them, for creating this network. But I would like to tell you two stories, anecdotes, that it's related to what Toby said yesterday, that is thinking a little bit out of the box. I mean, how we include these people that are not the usual suspects of these conversations, diplomats, us. These are people that normally we don't talk with them. So we can really see interesting stuff coming on. One judge from an appeals court wrote to me last week. He's an alumni of this course that we did. And he said, look, I want to tell you that I used that thing of the triple tests in a recent decision I took, and I released that guy from jail. And he wrote, but I honestly think he should be in jail. But I released him anyway because you told me that I should apply the triple test. And applying the triple test, I should release him. So please be sure that you are teaching us the right thing. So I think this is a wonderful story that these guys that we all normally, well, you all know jokes about judges and how they think they are above God or things like that. But even though they are accepting to sit there and listening to people to tell them how to apply the triple test of United Nations, whatever, the Inter-American Commission. So I think here we have a very positive trend in the terms of the demand. I mean, these 80,000 people, they were there and we opened the courses and they wanted to do it. We didn't force them. We are not paying them. We are not giving credits or any university, whatever thing they could get. And they are not traveling to New York. They are doing that online in their houses in Bolivia, in Honduras, in Nicaragua. So I think this is one interesting story. And the other one is that we need to show those things have a meaning for the real world. It's not about because it is in the international law, they need to apply those things. So in Brazil in 2016, and I finish with this anecdote, a journalist requested the freedom of information for the Brazilian Air Force, wanting to know a very simple thing. How many human organs were transported by a Brazilian Air Force airplane? Because you know Brazil is a very big country, so if you have to transplant an organ, you need an airplane to take the heart in Amazon and take it to Porto Alegre, 6 hours flight. And this guy discovered with this freedom of information request that during a period of 6 months, only 5 human organs have been transported by the Brazilian Air Force airplanes. So he was an investigative journalist, he did it, and he discovered why. Because the airplanes were actually reserved for transporting authorities, senators, judges, whatever. So of course this headline was a scandal. So the president, after this, issued a decree saying that always a Brazilian Air Force airplane should be reserved for transporting organs, and not only authorities. The 6 months after the decree, 172 human organs were transported. So when I tell this story to the judges and I say, look, freedom of information actually literally saves lives, then they started to understand why it's so important to be engaged in this conversation. So that's, I think, it's our challenge here. Thanks.
Thank you, Guilherme. Finally, Irene, why do we need an SDG 16? What difference does it make on the ground?
Okay, good. That's an interesting question because, of course, we've spent a couple of hours talking about it and why do we need it. I think a number of panelists have actually made the point that it is not about freedom of expression in itself. Yes, that's a value in itself, but that's not what we're talking about here. In the context of the SDGs, we're talking about the impact it has on development. And that's why, as you said, SDG 5, which is about gender equality, SDG 2, which is about food security, SDG 8, which is about equality, all these different SDGs coming together. How do you link that up with 16? Because 16 forces the development community and governments to think about systemic change, not just about reaching certain figures or outcomes, how many lives you have saved or how many children go to school, but the underlying institutional barriers that prevent progress and how do you empower people to demand progress. That's what 16 is about. But we've talked a lot about it already. So let me move to one point, and that is that SDG 16, there is something at the heart of SDG 16, and that is access to justice. And access to justice is actually the way in which you can access all your human rights, including freedom of expression. And I think there isn't enough attention given to the importance of the rule of law, which makes everything else work. It is really the enabling element there. And there are a number of reasons why that is not fully understood. If you were to walk out of this room, out into the street, and ask someone, what is the rule of law, they'd give you a blank look. It's a very complex idea. It's not only about judges. It's about the principle of equal protection and equal accountability. It's about how fair laws are made and applied. Now, you talked about teaching judges how to understand the value of freedom of expression. My organization is in the business of capacity development, and we do a lot of capacity development in the justice sector, primarily of the judiciary, but also of bar associations, of ministries of justice, and so on. And there is an issue in my country. Judges are applying the law on this area, but there is a law on criminal libel. The criminal libel, the concept of criminal libel was created by the British as a colonial power to criminalize people for saying something. So it wasn't libel, not a civil issue, but a criminal issue. It still applies. And what happens is thousands of journalists, media editors are threatened with criminal libel, and therefore they self-censor. So the law itself, so one has to broaden the concept of rule of law to understand what are the underpinnings of those principles. And if you don't get those principles right, you're not going to be able to move other parts of SDG 16, but of the whole 2030 agenda. There's a relationship, the beauty of the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and the challenge of it is that interrelationship, the integration. And that makes it extremely complex for governments to report. It makes it extremely complex for bureaucrats to deal with. But on the other hand, that's what actually makes things happen. And I would go further to say that given that sort of fundamental nature of the rule of law, there is a big weakness in that the rule of law does not sit easily in an institution. There isn't any, like, if you talk about child rights, you have UNICEF. You talk about refugees, you have the High Commissioner for Refugees. You talk about human rights, you have the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Where does the rule of law sit in the international community? Within the UN system, you have different entities that deal with it. You have the UN ODC, the Organization for Drugs and Crime. You have UNDP, which looks at development and justice issues. You have DPKO, the peacekeeping, that look at it from the perspective of policing and enforcement in conflict-affected countries. So this sort of fragmentation actually does have an impact on how the international community is going to use this concept of the rule of law and push it through. On the other side, every challenge is also an opportunity. The opportunity means that we don't have to put all our eggs in one basket. We need to approach this through different areas. We haven't talked about the UN Human Rights Council, although we have a special rapporteur sitting in the room. But let us look at those other machineries. There is no reason why one should not talk about SDG 16 at the UN Human Rights Council. Just as there is no reason why one should not talk about human rights, no logical reason why one should not talk about human rights in the development domain. There are political reasons why it doesn't happen. So I think using the power of the UN more broadly and the power of civil society and of academics and policy thinkers of getting the notion of the rule of law understood. And I'm going to, we heard about anecdotes about judges. Now I'm going to tell you about the experience we have where China is a member party of my organization. And I was recently invited to go to China to talk about SDG 16 at one of their universities, the so-called Red University, Renmin. And of course, I knew going into that lecture hall that it would be extremely difficult to convey to the audience the idea of the rule of law in China. That's obvious to anyone who's been dealing with Western legal thought. But what I realized after I gave my talk and we had started the Q&A and so on, what I realized that the audience was grappling with the notion not of the rule of law, but of law itself. Because I had presented the rule of law as enabling development. It's an enabler because it regulates environmental issues. It ensures non-discrimination in access to discrimination, access to resources, services, and so on. It enables investment and therefore promotes economic growth. The Chinese don't think of law as an enabler. They think of law as a punitive measure, because that's how it works in the Chinese system. Policy enables development, and policy comes from their executive. The courts do not play a role, do not play a regulatory role. There is no concept of administrative law in the way in which we would understand it in Western countries or other legal systems. And so you can see how big the challenge is if you even have to convey that. So it's a very complex idea, the rule of law and access to justice, yet it is the oil that makes the wheel turn around. And I think what we need is much more collaboration. Collaboration between the human rights community and the development community, collaboration between those who are working on 16.10 and those who are working on 16.3, and so on. And together, I think we're going to break this barrier, we're going to get people to understand what the relationship is, because on the ground, people know what the relationship is. Now, the newspaper editor in my country, in Bangladesh, who is being charged with criminal libel, he understands how the rule of law is failing because the judiciary is not independent, because the laws are outdated, and he's caught in that trap. There is no media censorship. Doesn't need to have any media censorship. You don't need to kill a journalist. You just deprive him of his livelihood. Right? So there are many ways in which you undermine the system if you don't get the basic concept of the rule of law embedded in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda.
Thank you, Irene. I am afraid that we're run out of time, but I am. We have 10 minutes? Good. The boss is Toby.
Oh, yeah, okay, good, there we go. Good, well, I can sit back down. So I want to dig a little bit into Bill's comments on the measurement of implementation of 1610.2, the adoption and implementation of access to information laws. And you said that it's easy enough to measure the first one, have they adopted a law? And I think that sort of superficially that's true, but I want to push you a little bit on that. Many of you will know that my organization runs the Right to Information rating, so we have assessed all of the access to information laws in the world and rated them out of a score up to 150. And basically, if it sort of walks and talks like a duck, we stick it on there. And we have, I think, up to 120. We're having some problems with the website, so not everything's up there yet. But we have, I just looked now, and we have 25 countries whose score is below 75, so they're failing grade. And the bottom country, Austria, has a score of 22%. Okay? I'm not even sure if that's a duck, but if it's a duck, it can't swim. You know, I don't think it's acceptable for the UN to say anything that looks at all like a duck, we're going to accept it as a law. So the first one, I think, you know, UNESCO have to have some kind of way of saying that's not good enough, even for the first part of it. When it comes to the second part, implementation, you know, we all know that's much, much more difficult. I would just mention two things that are happening in the civil society side. One of the hats I wear is as chair of the Freedom of Information Advocates Network, which is the kind of global community of you know, access to information advocates. And within that, we have developed a simple methodology for civil society assessment of implementation. It's a simple, crude methodology, but it gives you some basic information whether the law is being implemented. It's designed for civil society, but I think it could reasonably easily be adapted for the government side. Another piece of work that I'm doing, my organization is doing in Pakistan, is we are developing a much more sophisticated kind of all singing, all dancing implementation assessment tool. Now, we're doing it in the context of Pakistan, but the people we're working with there, GIZ, have much bigger aspirations, and we will sort of, you know, when we finish it, we'll launch it globally and whatever. And, you know, that is not designed for civil society. I think it could be good for anyone. It will cost some money to apply because it's all singing, all dancing. But, you know, I mean, there should be money for that. And then finally, and I don't know, Bill, if you have some comments on that, but I have a question which I'm a little bit embarrassed, but I have to put it to Guilherme because he's the only UNESCO representative there. What is UNESCO doing on this? I was at a meeting, and Bill was there too, about a year and a half ago, where we discussed all about this. I had some follow-ups with Faxen-Banda at UNESCO, who's moved on now, and some things, but I mean, are you developing some methodology? I mean, this is a complicated thing. What are you doing about it?
How about having Agnes' question and then we, you know, if someone else. Okay, good. So Agnes.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One is whether some of you could reflect on whether there is a role for universities in terms of supporting the implementation of SDG 16, if there is any specific function that you can attribute to universities. And then a bigger question related to the nature of global leadership that maybe Alvaro can respond to that one or someone else. In the global context that you have set for us, what kind of leaders do we need? And what kind of leadership will allow to manage this difficult time so that we can maybe proceed with a better or a more positive outcome? Based on yesterday's conversation and on what you have pointed out to us, it seems to me that it's not just about systemic, structural changes without a face. And leaders and leadership can play a big role. I'm wondering whether you could reflect on the kind of leaders and leadership at global level that we need.
Thank you. Our last question, and then you'll have like 1 minute and a half. And let's see, could you, let's hear the last, and then you start, because he has to go.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Chinmayi Arun. I work at National Law University, Delhi. Thank you for what was a very educational session. I wanted to push you a little in a direction, in the direction of the conversation we were having yesterday, which is that I understand that SDG 16 already presents a set of very complex problems, but I'm curious about what you think that the age of automation and of businesses controlling information adds to to these problems. And from that point of view, I'm curious about whether there has been a thread to this narrative from a business and human rights point of view.
Thank you, Alejandro, and thank you for being here. I know you have to run.
Yeah, sorry, very. So I will try to address the very difficult question that you are asking, and then, I think that the short answer, for that question would be that, we are at a moment, I would say, in, our history where we are looking for leaders that can look well beyond their own constituency, their own country, take responsibility for global governance. And obviously, there are some leaders that need to take more responsibility than others because, there are more, countries that are more powerful than others. But we certainly, we are at this very moment needing leaders that can take responsibility beyond the countries, that can compromise, that can, dialogue, and all of this, with an engagement on this common ground that we have, as I mentioned before, which is our, common values. Now, there's many other things that, leaders need to have, but I would, I think they're going to have to go into more details. But, what we are looking for right now, I would say, is the capacity to, have a dialogue, make a compromise, think about, our, global community as a whole. And this is to tackle, the most important issues that we are facing, like, from climate change to peace and security. I'm very sorry I have to run, but thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much for being here, Alejandro. Gracias. Lucy.
Thank you. So there's a few things here. I think I'll add on this discussion on the kind of leadership we need for a new age. Alejandro mentioned that we need to focus on the common values and the common grounds that's really been presented by, Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the growing body of human rights law over the past several decades. As we've seen, we discussed, sometimes this is being rejected on the grounds that it's kind of a Western agenda and there's a kind of, SDG 16 is a kind of interventionism. But actually, the research has been done, global comparative cultural research to show that the seeds which are of the cultural, the norms about equality, equal respect for all of humanity exist in all cultures. They're reflected in the language of these cultures, they're reflected in the stories, they're reflected in the values. I think it would be a powerful support to empower our artists to present this common values, to present the vision that's presented in the body of human rights law and in the 2030 agenda in a way that engages the heart and the head. Because I think whilst we do need data and we do need statistics, it's so important, as I said, for evidence-based action, there's something about that level of discussion that means that it passes, the rational mind can kind of come up with a counter-argument or another set of statistics. And there's something about artistic modes of expression that bypass that and somehow affect people at a more fundamental level. So I think now that, and I really applaud UNESCO for its work on this, and I think it's becoming ever more important, global citizenship education and culture of peace. I believe that SDG 4.7 on promoting a culture of peace and global citizenship education is absolutely key. We don't give up on the generation of leaders we have now and that we'll have in the next few years, but I think it's really important that we look to the next generation and building their capacity to, for example, as Alejandro said, the capacity to dialogue, the capacity to empathize, the capacity to connect across boundaries of country, culture, race, and religion. These are the kind of capabilities I think we need to create a new world. And interestingly, if we all have those capabilities, we wouldn't have the kind of leadership that we've been used to at this point, which is more or less, I'm surprised the word is coming to mind now, but a patriarchal model of looking for our leader, whoever that may be, male or female, typically male. Maybe the future is about collaborative leadership, collective leadership, and the future of leadership looks very different from what we're used to at this point.
Okay. Bill?
Just to jump right back, I mean, Toby, you're right, of course. I mean, anything, when I say simple, I mean this in UN terms, where nothing is ever simple. What is simple about it in the sense of the bureaucratic, mechanical part of it is that now there is in effect a requirement for sovereign member states of the 193 to report whether they contend they have an access to information law or not. That's the point of departure. Now, clearly, it would be great if there was some agreed international standard for what are the minimum requirements for such a law to actually be counted and called such a law. But as you know better than anyone, there are not, nor are there likely to be. So the next step is making sure that accompanying that initial reporting point is some kind of systematic reporting process, which is not exclusively from the governments themselves, which includes information from users, experts, and others, which is, again, where the phrase implementation comes in. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that you go back to the goal and the target itself. The target is access to information, of which the passage and implementation of a law is only one part, of course, because we're talking about, do ordinary citizens, can they get the information that they need? And even within the narrow realm of official information, official documents and so forth, the proactive disclosure of that information in many countries happens on separate tracks from what the requirements of a law may or may not have. And then, of course, you have the additional issue of the digital divide in many societies. Even if it does exist electronically, do people have the ability to see it? Is it available in the languages that they speak? And there's a whole realm of things which are, by definition, different from one country to the other. So I think one aspect of the SDGs, which is very relevant here, is that these goals and targets and progress towards them need to be defined on a national, local level as well as the global level for them to have any real meaning. But that requires media and civil society to be involved in charting progress in every phase on both the national and international level.
Thank you, Bill. Irene?
Jump in because it's part of the question Tobe did about this. So first, every question about my colleagues in Paris, the right person to address is Ricardo, that is set just right to you, because he is the one collecting, he is in your side. He is the UN colleague, UNESCO-based New York colleague collecting difficult questions to Paris, but just joking. I think that there are some things here that first, what the custodian agencies need to do, it's a very hard, complicated job that is offered one paragraph assessing the entire world for that annual report. So you can see how hard it is to then what we are going to say in this one paragraph. This is one of the difficulties, but not only for UNESCO, the entire system, the different custodian agencies for the different indicators. This is one. Second, I think that what they are trying to do is exactly to identify what is already available in terms like your index, but also, for instance, the Red de Transparencia Acceso a la Información Pública in Latin America. They have a very robust set of indicators, not only for the laws, but for the entire system. And this could be a kind of a champion case for other countries. So they're trying now to say, well, this is what is available, and UNESCO can facilitate a more global discussion, having in mind what we already exists. This is another. Third, stimulating the shadow reports per civil society, because this is also an important component of this discussion, as you know very well. But finally, and I think this is very, very important, sometimes we mistake the SDG agenda as a UN Secretariat agenda, where this is a member states agenda. They signed the declaration and they requested our support as facilitators. So when they decided the indicators in the UN Statistical Commission, their statistical bodies, they're saying, this is what we are going to report about. So I think the custodian agencies should be really involved in helping member states to produce significant data regarding what they already have decided. And finally, although we UN bureaucrats are not the most successful example of Darwinist evolution, we are not that bad. So when you see the indicator regarding the law, the existing law, it's saying according to international treaties and guarantees. So I think this is the trick for that duck to be at least a duck that can swim. So what is the law according to international standards is part of what your organization does when accessing the law. So I think we need to stick to this part of the phrase, so otherwise it would be just a ticking box exercises of having whatever law they want. No? Thanks.
According to internal laws and international standards, so, okay.
But
so
both, not just internal.
Yes,
no?
good, good. Yeah. I mean, would you like to?
Just to add one point, what I noticed in the 2016, I think, UNESCO report was that the trend, the global trend, is for access to information is growing. But the right to impart information is being restricted. So you can see the problem. Now, for the two questions, one was about the age of automation and is there thinking of that? No, I don't think there is any thinking. I mean, if we move away from the discussion on freedom of expression and look at the goal on employment, there is no understanding of automation that is creating unemployment in the SDG discussion. There hasn't been full understanding of what impact automation is going to have on employment goal. So in the same way, I think the UN is behind, and when I say the UN, I don't mean the Secretariat, I mean all the governments who are discussing this. They have still got to grapple with the implications of automation. On the one hand, they see the advantage of it in terms of economic growth and education and so on. On the other hand, they also see the threat that would come out of transparency and greater accountability. And sometimes they take very stupid actions of shutting down websites and then figure out afterwards that it's actually affecting their banking services as much as their security services. So they have to figure out a lot in that area. Now, coming to the point, Agnes's point about the nature of global leadership, I have been rather surprised at how silent we have been about the issue of gender and gender equality. And for me, that is actually one of those big social forces that's going to change the way we talk about ICT as a force, we talk about nationalism and inward turning, isolationism and so on. But I think the rise of women's movement, the rise of interest in gender equality, and the growing, emerging, I think, power of young people. I think those are going to determine also the nature of global leadership in the future. Just look at the Me Too movement, hashtag Me Too, and what it has done, where icons have fallen one by one, both in civil society as well as in other sectors. And I think there is something there that the UN and other global bodies, national bodies, will have to take into account. And I think that, I don't know how it's going to be. I don't know whether women will make better leaders than men. I don't think so necessarily. But I think there are factors that will come onto the table that haven't been there before. And that will change the way in which we address issues. And I think that's a good thing. Change of leadership is a good thing.
Thank you, Irene. Michael?
Just very quickly, I'll take a shot at Agnes's very easy question about global leadership. So, I mean, I think we're looking for leaders with principles who operate on the basis of the values that are reflected in the Universal Declaration, but also leaders who are pragmatic, who are committed to the multilateral system, and who have the diplomatic sort of capacity and capital to actually move the global conversation. I think, actually, if you look at President Macron's speech to Congress this week, the things that he said about the Iran deal and about climate change and to potentially hostile audience, I think that's leadership in my eyes. So I think there are examples. At the same time, I think Irene and Lucy's points about kind of not looking for a savior are important. I think the kind of diffusion of leadership, what Moises Naim calls the end of power, is important, and that there's leadership in increasingly in civil society and in different places that we should be looking at. And I think even within the just the government space, I think it's important that we not put all our eggs in one or a few baskets. And that I mentioned this earlier when I talked a little bit about sort of emerging, at least regional, if not global powers, and the role that they're playing or failing to play. And I would just wonder if we need to take a fresh look at things like the Community of Democracies. Some of the multilateral fora that have existed in the past that were supposed to be a vehicle for, like-minded states that believe in the sorts of things that we're talking about in this session, but haven't operated in the way they need to be able to, I think, resist some of the challenges that Alejandro and others at this table have discussed. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah, Edison Lanza is asking me for 10 seconds before we close this amazing panel. So Edison,
Thank you,
10
Catalina.
seconds.
No, just to inform an important process that takes place in the OAS. As you know, the OAS has a model law of access of information, and now all the countries approve a decision to upgrade this model of law that had a great impact in the national law, and just started the last week. And I think it's a good practice because it's in the framework of the substantive development 16.
Thank you. Less than 10 seconds. Thank you, all of you. I mean, this was great and hopeful and wonderful and optimistic.